couple of people at the immigration department. So
You've got some friends there?
yes, we do, and they let us by.
At 13 years old, Frankie Lymon stood in front of a microphone and made the entire world fall in love with him. Why Do Fools Fall in Love didn't just top the charts. It redefined what popular music could sound like, and it did so through the voice of a child from Harlem who sang like heaven had personally trained him. Disc jockeys called him the next Sammy Davis Jr. Ed Sullivan wanted him back repeatedly. He was mobbed in the streets of London. And then, before he turned 26, he was found dead on a bathroom floor, with not a single person who knew him bothering to show up and say goodbye. What happened in between those two moments is one of the most devastating stories in music history. Before there was Michael Jackson moonwalking across a stage in a sequined glove, before there was a young Prince charming audiences with impossible notes, before the entire concept of the teenage pop idol even existed as a marketable product, there was Frankie Lymon. And if you don't know that name, that's exactly the problem. Born on September 30th, 1942, in Washington Heights, New York, Frankie was the second of 5 sons raised in a household where gospel music wasn't just entertainment, it was air. His father, Howard Lymon, sang in a gospel group, and from the moment Frankie could form words, he was singing them with a precision and soul that made grown adults stop mid-conversation just to listen. This wasn't a talent that was groomed in a studio or manufactured by some label executive with a clipboard. This was something raw, something God-given, something that Harlem recognized immediately as its own. By the time he was 12 years old, Frankie had joined a street corner doo-wop group called the Ermines. Within a year, they had reorganized, renamed themselves the Teenagers, and were performing in apartment hallways and on street corners for anyone willing to pause their day and hear something beautiful. That beauty caught the ear of Richard Barrett, a talent scout for G Records, who brought the group to label owner George Goldner. What happened next should have been a fairy tale. In many ways, it looked like one. In 1956, when Frankie Lymon was just 13 years old, Why Do Fools Fall in Love was released and promptly detonated across the American music landscape like a sonic bomb. It hit number 6 on the pop charts and reached number 1 on the R&B charts. Overnight, this boy from Harlem, this child, became the hottest name in rock and roll. He performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. He headlined the London Palladium. He was photographed, adored, screamed at, and celebrated on a level that no black teenager in America had ever experienced before. He was 13. Let that sit for a moment. A 13-year-old child was suddenly navigating sold-out concert halls, international tours, television appearances, and the relentless machinery of mid-century American entertainment, with no legal protection, no financial literacy, and no adult in his corner who wasn't directly profiting from his existence. The contracts he signed during those early months? Devastating. The royalty arrangements? Constructed to ensure the money flowed upward and never quite reached the boy whose voice was generating all of it. Frankie Lymon owned the world's heart, but someone else owned everything else. And that arrangement, invisible to the screaming fans, invisible to the television cameras, was already quietly writing the ending to his story. Here is something the music industry has always understood, even when it pretends otherwise. Youth is not just an asset. In the world of 1950s pop music, youth was the entire product. And when that product changed, when puberty arrived uninvited and began dismantling the very instrument that had made Frankie Lymon a household name, the industry didn't grieve. It simply reached for the next shiny thing on the shelf. Frankie's voice began to crack and deepen around 1957. He was 14 years old. 14. The same age most kids are nervously navigating high school hallways. Frankie was watching his entire career restructure itself around a biological process he had absolutely no control over. The teenagers, sensing the shift, began to distance themselves. G Records, sensing the same shift, encouraged Frankie to pursue a solo career, not out of loyalty or belief in his future, but because splitting him from the group made the legal and financial architecture significantly easier to manage. For the label, it was a business decision. For Frankie, it felt like abandonment dressed up as an opportunity. The solo records came. They were decent. They were not magic. The world that had gone absolutely delirious over the boy soprano from Harlem was considerably less interested in the transitional voice of a teenager trying to find his footing in a genre that had already begun moving on without him. By 1957, rock and roll itself was evolving at a ferocious pace. Elvis was redefining what a male pop star could look and sound like. Little Richard was pushing boundaries that made label executives sweat. In that landscape, a 16-year-old Frankie Lymon with a changing voice and no creative control over his own recordings was simply not a priority. What no one talks about enough is what this does to a child psychologically. Fame is intoxicating under any circumstances. But fame at 13, followed by systematic irrelevance at 16, creates a kind of emotional whiplash that most adults would struggle to survive. Frankie had never had the chance to develop an identity outside of being a star. He had skipped childhood, skipped adolescence, skipped every normal developmental stage that might have given him the internal tools to process rejection. When the applause faded, there was nothing underneath it to catch him, and so he fell. The heroin entered his life somewhere around this period, introduced, as it tragically was for so many young black musicians of that era, through the very circuit of clubs, after-parties, and industry insiders that were supposed to represent his world. This was not an accident of character. This was an environment deliberately constructed without safety nets, without oversight, without anyone whose job it was to protect the human being rather than the product. There was one man Frankie trusted above all others during this period. A mentor figure, someone he described as a father, someone who had access to his finances, his bookings, and his future. That man would later be revealed as one of the primary architects of Frankie's financial destruction. His name has largely escaped the headlines, but his fingerprints are all over what came next. February 27, 1968. Washington Heights, New York. A neighborhood that had once sent one of its own out into the world like a gift, like proof that talent and heart and raw God-given ability could transcend circumstance. That neighborhood got its son back on this morning, but not in any way anyone would have chosen. Frankie Lymon was found on the bathroom floor of his grandmother's house at 165th Street. A syringe was nearby. He was 25 years old. The official cause of death was a heroin overdose, and while that clinical explanation is technically accurate, it is also one of the most incomplete sentences ever written about a human life. Because the real causes, the ones that don't appear on any autopsy report, had been accumulating for over a decade. Exploitation, abandonment, predatory contracts, an industry that consumed a child and then discarded the adult he became without a second thought. What makes his death almost unbearable to sit with is the context surrounding it. Frankie had not given up. People close to him during his final years described a man who was still fighting, still attempting to claw his way back to relevance. He had recently enlisted in the United States Army, completed his service, and returned to New York with what appeared to be genuine sobriety and renewed determination. He was talking about a comeback. He was making calls. He believed, perhaps naively but completely, that the music industry owed him another chance at the spotlight it had built him up to occupy. He was wrong, or rather, he ran out of time to find out. The tragedy of February 27th was compounded almost immediately by what followed. When news of his death broke, the silence from the entertainment world was deafening. The same industry that had plastered his face on magazine covers, that had booked him into the most prestigious venues in the world, that had profited enormously from his voice and his image and his undeniable star power, that industry collectively looked away. There were no tributes from major labels, no television specials, no gathering of contemporaries to mark the passing of the boy who had arguably invented the teenage pop idol template. The funeral was its own kind of tragedy. Accounts from those who were present, and there were heartbreakingly few, describe a sparse, muted affair that bore absolutely no resemblance to the scale of Frankie's cultural impact. The pews were not filled with music executives or fellow artists or the fans who had once screamed his name until their throats gave out. They were largely empty. The boy who had performed before thousands, who had stood on the stage of the London Palladium and brought the house down, was buried in relative obscurity at United States Military Cemetery at Arlington. A dignified resting place, yes, but one that his family had to fight to secure, and one that went without a proper headstone for years. Years. A man who generated millions of dollars in revenue for an entire industry lay in an unmarked grave while the people who profited from his genius moved on to their next meal ticket without so much as placing a flower. But here is where the story takes its first sharp, unexpected turn. Because Frankie Lymon's story did not end on that bathroom floor, and it did not end at that sparse, half-empty funeral. In fact, in one of the most bizarre and combustible plot twists in music industry history, his story was just getting started. And it would take 3 women, 1 enormous royalty check, and a courtroom full of secrets to prove it. If you wanted to design a legal nightmare from scratch, you would be hard-pressed to engineer something more chaotic than what unfolded in the years following Frankie Lymon's death. Because while the music industry had moved on, while the pews at his funeral had sat largely empty, while his grave went without a headstone, the royalties from Why Do Fools Fall in Love had not stopped accumulating. Music has a cruel sense of humor that way. The man couldn't get a proper burial, but the song kept generating money long after he was gone. And in the mid-1980s, when a significant royalty dispute surrounding the song's authorship began working its way through the legal system, that money suddenly became very real, very large, and very contested. The question of who owned the rights to the song's royalties led directly to another question, one that nobody had apparently thought to ask clearly while Frankie was alive. Who, exactly, was his legal next of kin? That is when 3 women walked into the frame simultaneously, each carrying documentation, each carrying conviction, and each carrying a version of Frankie Lymon's private life that the public had never seen. The first was Elizabeth Waters. Frankie had married her in 1964, when he was 21, and she was a young woman from his neighborhood who had known him before the fame calcified into myth. Their relationship was real, documented, and legally registered. Elizabeth had lived through the difficult years with Frankie, witnessed his struggles firsthand, and believed without question that she was his widow. She had the paperwork to prove it. The second woman was Zola Taylor. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Zola was a member of the Platters, one of the most successful vocal groups of the 1950s, which made her not just a romantic figure in Frankie's life but a peer, someone who understood the specific gravitational pull of that world. Zola claimed that she and Frankie had married in 1955, which would have made her union with him the earliest of the 3, and potentially the most legally significant. She was passionate, credible, and utterly certain of her position. The third woman was Amira Eagle, a schoolteacher from Georgia who had married Frankie in February of 1967, just 1 year before his death. She had, by the timeline alone, the most recent claim. She described a private ceremony, a genuine relationship, and a husband who had been trying to rebuild his life in the months before it ended. 3 women, 3 marriages, potentially overlapping timelines, and one legal system tasked with determining which of these unions, if any, had been valid under the law. The implications were staggering. If Frankie had been legally married to Elizabeth in 1964, then his subsequent marriages could constitute bigamy, rendering them void. But if earlier documentation supported Zola's 1955 claim, the entire chronology collapsed into something far more complicated. Each woman had a story. Each story had evidence. And somewhere buried inside the contradiction of all 3 accounts was a truth about Frankie Lymon's private life that was far messier, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than any of his fans had ever imagined. There is something uniquely brutal about a courtroom that is tasked with dismantling a dead man's private life in order to determine who gets to grieve him officially. That is precisely what happened when the case of Frankie Lymon's estate moved into full legal proceedings, and what unfolded over the course of those hearings was less a straightforward inheritance dispute and more an archaeological excavation of a life lived in fragments, in secret and under enormous pressure. The proceedings drew significant attention, not just from legal observers but from the music world itself, because embedded within the question of who was Frankie's rightful widow was a much larger question about who actually owned the rights to Why Do Fools Fall in Love in the first place. These 2 legal threads, the marriage dispute and the royalty authorship claim, were intertwined in ways that made every testimony carry double the weight. Elizabeth Waters presented her case with quiet, methodical dignity. Her marriage certificate was legitimate. Her timeline was clear. She had documentation that any reasonable legal standard would recognize as valid proof of matrimony. Her attorneys argued that whatever came before or after her 1964 union with Frankie was either legally irrelevant or legally impossible to substantiate. Zola Taylor's testimony was something else entirely. She took the stand with the confidence of a woman who had spent decades performing in front of audiences and was not remotely intimidated by a courtroom. She described her relationship with Frankie in vivid, intimate detail, the way they met, the private moments that only a spouse would know. The ceremony she insisted had taken place in 1955. Her credibility was genuine and her emotion was raw. But her documentation was where things became complicated. The paper trail supporting a formal 1955 marriage was inconsistent, and the opposing attorneys pressed those inconsistencies with surgical precision. Amira Eagle, the Georgia schoolteacher, offered perhaps the most quietly devastating testimony of all three. She spoke about Frankie in his final year, the man he was trying to become, the sobriety he was fighting for, the future he was planning. Her account painted a portrait of someone who had not surrendered, someone still reaching toward something better. It was heartbreaking precisely because it humanized him at a moment when the legal process was in danger of reducing him to nothing more than an asset to be assigned. Then came the document that shifted everything. Buried within the legal filings, an earlier registration surfaced, paperwork that called into question the legal standing of at least one of the marriages in a way that none of the three women's legal teams had fully anticipated. The details of that document sent the proceedings into a temporary recess while attorneys recalibrated their entire strategies. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the energy of a case everyone expected to resolve cleanly, suddenly understood that nothing about Frankie Lymon's life or death was going to be simple. And while these three women fought over the right to be called his widow, an entirely different group of people were sitting comfortably in offices, watching the chaos unfold, and quietly relieved that nobody in that courtroom was asking the question that actually mattered most. Where had all the real money gone? The courtroom was about to find out just how deep that rabbit hole went. Let's talk about the money. Because at the center of everything, the broken marriages, the legal chaos, the unmarked grave, the sparse funeral, there was always the money. Specifically, the staggering, almost incomprehensible gap between what Frankie Lymon generated for the music industry and what the music industry ever allowed him to keep. Why Do Fools Fall in Love was not a minor hit. It was a cultural earthquake. Released in 1956, it sold over 1 million copies in its first pressing alone, a number that in the mid-50s represented the kind of commercial success that label owners built vacation homes on. It charted internationally. It was covered, sampled, and re-released across multiple decades. A 1981 Diana Ross cover version reignited the song's commercial life and introduced it to an entirely new generation of listeners, generating a fresh wave of royalties that should have, by any reasonable standard, found their way to Frankie's estate. They largely did not. The mechanism that made this possible was neither complicated nor hidden. It was simply the standard operating procedure of an industry that had constructed its contracts specifically to prevent young, black, working-class artists from ever accumulating the kind of wealth their talent created. The concept of the master recording, the original recorded track, ownership of which determines who collects the lion's share of royalties for eternity, was weaponized against artists like Frankie with breathtaking consistency. George Goldner and G Records retained ownership of the masters. Frankie, who had signed his contract at 13 without independent legal representation, retained essentially nothing. Morris Levy, the powerful and notoriously predatory music industry figure who was deeply embedded in the ownership structure surrounding G Records, was one of the architects of this system. Levy, who would later be convicted of extortion charges with documented ties to organized crime, operated a financial ecosystem in which the artists were the raw material and the executives were the refiners, processors, and distributors of the wealth those artists created. Frankie was not the only victim of this machinery. He was simply one of its most visible casualties. What makes the situation even more enraging in retrospect is the songwriting credit attached to Why Do Fools Fall in Love. For decades, the song was credited exclusively to Morris Levy and one other party, effectively erasing Frankie's contribution as a co-writer entirely. It took years of legal battles, long after Frankie's death, for his authorship to be partially recognized, and even that recognition came too late and delivered too little to the people who deserved it most. The royalty dispute that had triggered the Three Widows courtroom drama was itself a byproduct of this larger theft. The amount being contested in court was significant, but it represented only a fraction of what the song had actually generated across its commercial lifetime. The bulk of those earnings had already been absorbed, redistributed, and quietly disappeared into corporate structures designed specifically to make that kind of accountability impossible. And yet, through all of it, Through the legal battles and the systemic theft and the decades of erasure, Frankie Lymon's voice kept playing on radios, in movies, in television commercials, in wedding receptions, and in the memories of anyone who had ever heard it and felt something shift inside their chest. The industry took everything from him. Could not take that. But the question of what truly happened in his final hours, a question that the official record has always answered a little too quickly and a little too cleanly, was about to get a great deal more complicated. There is a version of Frankie Lymon's story that ends with a simple, sad moral about the dangers of fame and addiction and the music industry's ruthlessness. That version is true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. Because the closer you look at the final chapter of his life, the more you realize that the official narrative, the clean, clinical story of a troubled young man who succumbed to his demons alone in a bathroom, contains gaps that have never been satisfactorily explained. Let's start with what we know about his influence because context matters here. Michael Jackson cited Frankie Lymon as a foundational inspiration, studying his performance footage obsessively as a child and modeling the Jackson 5's early presentation on the energy and charisma that Frankie had pioneered more than a decade earlier. Ronnie Spector of the Ronettes spoke about him with reverence. Little Richard acknowledged him. The entire architecture of the teenage pop idol, the choreography, the crowd interaction, the emotional accessibility of a young male voice addressing young female audiences, was something Frankie had essentially invented at 13 years old on a street corner in Harlem. That legacy eventually caught up with history in the ways it deserved. A headstone was finally placed at his grave. The 1998 film Why Do Fools Fall in Love, starring Larenz Tate as Frankie and featuring Halle Berry, Vivica A. Fox, and Lela Rochon as the three women who claimed his name, brought his story to a mainstream audience that had largely forgotten him. The film was imperfect, as biopics always are, but it accomplished something important. It forced a conversation about who Frankie Lymon was, what was taken from him, and why the industry that benefited most from his genius had worked so hard to ensure he remained a footnote. But here is where we return to that final night. February 26, 1968. The hours before Frankie was found on that bathroom floor. The witness account that never made it into the official police report describes a visitor. Someone who arrived at his grandmother's house that evening. Someone who was known to Frankie. Someone who carried a briefcase and left in a hurry. This account, which surfaced years later through a person connected to Frankie's immediate social circle, was never formally investigated. The official determination of accidental overdose closed the case before those kinds of questions had room to breathe. What was in the briefcase? The person who shared this account believed it contained the only remaining documentation Frankie had managed to hold on to: handwritten records of royalty payments, correspondence with label representatives, and personal notes that may have constituted the beginnings of a legal case he was quietly building against the people who had stolen from him. If that is true, and it has never been proven, but it has never been disproven either, then Frankie Lymon did not simply die alone on a bathroom floor. He was silenced. And the boy from Harlem who taught the world how to feel something when a voice hit the right note never got the chance to make them answer for it. Some ghosts, though, refuse to stay buried. The song still plays. The voice still carries. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear a 13-year-old kid from Washington Heights asking the question that nobody in power ever wanted to answer. Why do fools fall in love? Maybe the better question is, why do industries devour the very voices that make them immortal, and then act surprised when history comes back to collect? Frankie Lymon deserved better. And the least we can do all these decades later is make sure the world never forgets his name again. Decades after his death, a witness came forward with a detail about the night Frankie died. A detail that wasn't in the autopsy and wasn't reported by the press. It involves a mysterious visitor who was seen leaving the house just hours before Frankie was found, carrying a briefcase that supposedly contained the only thing Frankie had left of value. If this account is true, Frankie Lymon wasn't just a victim of his own demons. He was a victim of a final, cold-blooded theft that happened while he was still breathing.